on this evening and then tomorrow morning. And as I said yesterday, we're going to start by looking at this issue of fighting power and the moral component of that. Then I want to look at the issue of failure, and then I want to finish by looking at the issue of courage. But if I've got that mission, you've got a mission as well. And your mission is to listen and then give me a hard time in questions. But if you decide that you finish your mission before I finish mine, then please snore quietly or just slip away and leave the rest of us crack on. And secondly, I want to start by sharing my favourite quote. I didn't know there was going to be quite so many ex-military or serving military with me, but my favourite quote is by H.G. Wells, who is reputed to have said that the professional military mind is by necessity an inferior and unimaginative mind. No man of high intellectual ability would willingly imprison his gifts in such a calling. So that's me, and one or two others. But he's supposed to have met Stalin once and left thinking Stalin was a nice bloke, so maybe we don't have to worry. The principal role of any military organisation is to deliver fighting power. That's why we have the British military, why any other military around the world. Deliver fighting power. There are no prizes for coming second on the battlefield. The test is war and battle. The result is triumph or defeat. So as you watch an army, and I'll talk about army because that's my background, as you watch an army going off to war, engaging in war, as I said yesterday, what goes through your mind as you think about will they succeed or not? Look at what's happening in Ukraine today in terms of how the Ukrainians are dealing with the Russians. The British Army talks about three components of fighting power, three chunks of fighting power. The first is the physical component, and I think this applies to business and in many ways to the rest of our life too. First is the physical component. It's the stuff. It's the tanks, the aeroplanes, the logistics to sustain it, the ability to deliver modern equipment onto that battlefield. The second is the conceptual component. Okay, you've got all this stuff, you've got the latest IT systems, you've got the latest drones, whatever. Do you know how to use them well? Do you know how to get the best out of that stuff on the battlefield? And for many people that might be it. We watch the task force sailing off, we know they've got lots of stuff, they're a professional military, professional army, they know how to use it, and we reckon that they're going to do well. In the first Gulf War, the Iraqis had shed loads of stuff. I mean, literally, hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces and hundreds of thousands of soldiers. They had shed loads of stuff. But the conceptual component, the understanding of how to fight that stuff, was sadly lacking. They just fought a long war with Iran, effectively using First World War tactics, advancing over the desert, attritional warfare. And the coalition, led by the Americans, of course, we had a big, very strong armoured division there too. We used what we now call, then being developed, manoeuvre warfare, outthinking as well as outfighting the enemy. And the whole thing was done and dusted in 100 hours. So the conceptual component can make a huge difference. But the third component, that's not the end of the story. The third component that we talk about in our doctrine is this moral component of fighting power. At the heart of the moral component is the ability to get people to fight, and if necessary, die on the battlefield for the cause. Any analysis of military history shows you that the victorious army, in this case, is the one that has a strong moral component. And that doesn't necessarily mean a Christian component in the sense that many of us would think of it immediately. Take the Viet Cong, for example, fighting against the Americans during the Vietnam War. At the end of the day, the Americans had shed loads of stuff. They actually had a very good conceptual component. They never lost a tactical battle in Vietnam. The Viet Cong won in the end because their moral component was far stronger. America was completely undermined by a lack of support of the States and so on. Now, it's easy to talk about that. It's very difficult to define. And it's impossible, I would offer, to calculate. It's fostered through leadership, through good leadership. And it rests on words like trust and loyalty and friendship and love and duty and integrity and honour and all sorts of other words, especially within those who command and lead, but not exclusively. And it's all embedded into an ethos, a culture, which ultimately, I argue, rests on the word character, which is what separates out the good army from the brutal. So a moral component of fighting power for the military. What does that look like in the rest of society? I mentioned Jonathan Sacks yesterday, I think, and I think Jonathan Sacks is one of the best commentators of social Britain, really. Sadly, he died a few years ago, but I'd met him and exchanged ideas with him. He's a great guy. And Jonathan tells this story. Imagine that you are going to London, and for the first time you're taking with you your son or your daughter, your grandson or your granddaughter, nephew, niece, whatever. They're about 12 or 13 years old. They've never been to London before, and you've decided to take them out for the day. Actually, I'm doing this with my granddaughter in about a week's time. She's coming down from Scotland. She's never really been to London. Then you decide you're going to start the day by going on the London Eye, the Millennium Wheel. Anybody been on the London Eye? Yeah, quite a lot of people. I go by train from Aldershot to London. I get off at Waterloo, and the London Eye is about 5 minutes walk. And you get into the pod at the bottom. It used to be British Airways, isn't it? I think it's Emirates now, isn't it? I can't remember. And you take off in this pod, and it goes anti-clockwise, and you get to about 3 o'clock on the clock face, and the child says to you, "What's out there? What can we see?" And you remember you're on the south bank of the Thames, and you look across the north bank, and the first thing you can see as you look across the north bank slightly to the left, right on the River Thames, is House of Parliament, Big Ben, House of Parliament. So you explain to the child about political power, about how politics works, democracy works, and how the House of Parliament passed legislation, etc., etc. And the child, because they're your son, let's say, very sharp, asks you a few sharp questions, and you answer the questions, and by now the pod is at 12 o'clock on the clock face. And you sweep your arm majestically over to the right, and you look into the middle distance, and there are the tall buildings of the City of London. And you explain to the child about economic power, how economies are generated, money is generated and distributed, and you talk about the economy and the market. And the child asks you some pretty sharp questions. The pod by now is down at 9 o'clock on the clock face. You're coming into land, and you're feeling pretty pleased with yourself. The day's off with a good start. We've had a good discussion. We're getting on well. It's going to be a good day. And as you're coming into land, the child tugs you by the arm, points to the St. Paul's Cathedral, and points to Westminster Abbey, and says, "What are those buildings for? What do they do? What do they produce? What do they distribute?" And Jonathan simply says, "How do you answer the child?" It's a great question. The world of nation states is largely focused on the first two, politics and economics, which on the face of it are all that is needed to run a successful society, the state and the market. The state is about society as a collective body. Collectively, we, the citizens, decide that we're going to obey the law, recognising that it's in our individual, but also our collective interest to do so. You may have decided to run an occasional red light coming down here yesterday, but if you did it on a regular basis, you probably wouldn't have got here. We all understand it's in our interest to obey the law. The market is about society made up of us as private individuals who are free to exchange goods within the framework of the law to anybody who's prepared to buy from us or to sell to us. That's the essence of it. Power mediated through government, law, politics, and the courts, exchange mediated by money and the markets. And societies around the world approach the execution of those two in different ways, but most people would still argue that any problem can be solved by either passing a law or throwing money at it. When we hear the conversation about education or the health service, what's the answer to the health service? Chuck more money at it. What's the problem with the education? Pass the law. It will solve the problem. They're the equivalent, I would offer, to the fighting power equation of the physical component and the conceptual component. But there's a problem. As with fighting power, what this leaves out are some exceptionally important things, especially the words I referred to earlier. Truth, love, loyalty, trust, fidelity, integrity. Let's call those moral goods, as opposed to political goods or economic goods. Goods which can't be accounted for in terms of politics or economics, the state or the individual. Take friendship, for example. As I said yesterday, I worked with the House of Commons Defence Committee for quite a while, and I'm still in touch with quite a lot of people in Parliament. And I was surprised to hear yesterday, somebody rang me up and said, "Are we just about to pass a law to say that those guys who are with you over the weekend are to be your friend?" Well, we know that's rubbish. You can't legislate for friendship. Now, I knew that, so I brought £1,000 with me in cash, and I'm going to slip you all 50 quid, and I want you to be my friends. I was doing this the other week somewhere, and somebody at the back shouted out, give me 100 quid, you might be in with a chance. But we know that's rubbish too. You can't buy true friendship. But friendship's important to us, individually and collectively. It makes a significant difference to our lives. It builds, what I said yesterday, it builds community. It builds a place where people know me by name and they miss me when I'm not here. It's especially important, of course, in the military. I remember visiting one of my guys in the Birmingham hospital during the Iraq conflict. He'd lost both his legs and an arm in an EOD incident. He didn't sacrifice himself for king and country in a sort of grand way. He sacrificed himself for his mates. When he talked to soldiers, they talk about their mates. The guy who won the latest VC is a chap called Josh Leakey. And I could chat about the Leakey family. His dad was an air commodore in the RAF. Josh won a VC by taking his fighting patrol through a minefield over an extended period of time. And talking to him about it. He lives actually not far from Gately. He lives in Camberley. His dad lives in Camberley. And talking to Josh about it, he said, I just wanted to get my mates out of trouble. That's all he was the second commander, and that's what he wanted to do. It was all built around friendship. And there's a crucial difference between the state and the market on the one hand, those political and economic goods, and these moral goods that I'm talking about. Suppose you have total power, political power, and you decide to share it amongst other political parties. Do you have more power, political power, or less? Clearly, you've had to share it. You've got less ability to pass the legislation that you might have wanted to do. Say I did have £1,000, and by the way, I don't, so please don't mug me. Suppose I did have £1,000 and I distribute it amongst you all equally. Do I have more or do I have less? Clearly, I have less. I have less money than I started with. Now think of those moral goods that I talked about. If I share with you trust and integrity and honour and friendship and love, do I end up with more or less? That's the hub of the moral piece. The more I share, the more I get. I end up in more credit than I would otherwise have done. That's because these goods only exist in virtue of being shared. If we're not prepared to share them, then we end up as a lonely chap with no mates. They are the key differentiators between good and great people or societies over poor or ordinary ones. And from them flows the ability to get people to fight, to walk the extra mile, carry the extra burden, not just in the military, but in all the businesses that you are involved with and running day by day, to dig deep, to find the inner strength to deal with a personal crisis or to drive a business or a community forward. So maybe we now have an answer to the child's question. Those places, St Paul's Cathedral and Westminster Abbey, and there are others, primarily those places, the churches that we attend, are places which underpin the moral component of a society. They produce and distribute the moral goods which shape our personal, our social, our economic, our political lives. Or they should do. So the moral component of fighting power, the moral component in society, that's my first reference. My second has to do with what happens when both our individual and collective moral components, when those places are marginalised, when society and individuals begin to say, we don't need those places. When he was Bishop of Liverpool some years ago, Bishop James Jones, who I know quite well, he used to work in the media. And James had a knack of putting his finger on some really interesting issues. And he used to do the Radio 4 Thought for the Day quite often. I don't know how many of you listen to that, but it's something he used to do a lot. And in one of his slots, he quoted Roger McGough. Anybody know Roger McGough? He's a great Liverpudlian poet. And he's got some fantastic stuff. I bought my youngest son his poetry books, and it's Stephen's favourite even now. And James quotes Roger and says this: all the world's a soap, and all the men and women merely extras, merely bit players who drift in and out of the action in life. And there's no doubt that we live in a world that does seem to reduce everything to the level of a soap opera. Celebrities rule okay. Countless millions listen and read, watch, and constantly dream of what they too may become. Their lives governed by the goings-on of the stars of Hollywood, stage, screen, catwalk, or the sports field. Image is glorified in order to convince us that it is glamour and personality and fashion, rather than substance and character, that gets jobs, attracts lovers, catches the camera's eye, and lands the prize of public office and power. Locked into this celebrity culture, success is measured by what we have, not who we are. Everything, including relationships, morality, and spirituality, can be rebranded and relaunched. Our impoverished souls, says Bishop James, feast on the crumbs snatched from the tables of the celebrities, surrendering ourselves and our families, however reluctantly, so gullibly, to this new world. Friedrich Nietzsche, who some of you may have heard of, the 19th century German philosopher, would be delighted with the outcome that we're living through today. He wanted to abolish Christian morality because he saw it as but an attempt by self-serving religious leaders to control the weak and unthinking masses. And sadly, there is some truth in that, it has to be said. But he famously declared, you may have heard, that God is dead. We don't need an irrelevant God, he said, or the religious leaders and the buildings that go along with him. We must ourselves become gods, he argued, independent and totally free to create our own values. In the 1870s, he wrote a series of books attacking the values of Judaism and Christianity. What was natural to human beings, he wrote, is the will to power, political and economic power. That's all that mattered. What was wrong with Judaism and Christianity, he said, was that they are unnatural in putting right above might, compassion above ruthlessness. Instead of power, they are concerned with the powerless, the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the vulnerable. This is an inversion of our natural instincts, he argued, and it would never produce a society of strong, free human beings. Now, the God is dead argument is, of course, not new. That notion that we can simply create our own rules, that we can become our own God, is exactly what the serpent told Eve in the Garden of Eden as he handed her the apple. Eat this and you will be God. But many today, like Nietzsche, believe that there is no need for churches. Morality can be outsourced to politics, to economics, reducing it to a set of choices in which truth, right or wrong, have no meaning beyond my personal satisfaction. Religious faith, they smirk, is merely a handy shield to ward off fear, a comforting tune to whistle in the darkness. Without it, they argue, we too would have to face the terror of a meaningless life, naked. But if God is dead and religion is irrelevant, then there are no moral absolutes, no universal standards to which we should conform. We can't legislate for morality. And once a society has lost its respect for God's truth, there is no firm moral component, no anchor. The moral goods are blown away, shipwrecked, and washed up on the beaches by the storms of life. And the logical conclusion is that it becomes increasingly hard to argue that we shouldn't do something because it's unethical, or immoral, or dishonourable, or disloyal, or demeaning, or in a word, just wrong. Instead, we can get up to whatever we want and damn the consequences. As Dostoevsky famously said, if God is dead and there is no future life, then nothing would be immoral any longer. Everything would be permitted. And in the last 60 years, we've seen any number of atheistic, secular societies which have followed this philosophy through to its logical conclusions, with catastrophic consequences. Stalin's Russia, Mao's China, Pol Pot's Cambodia, Hitler's Germany, to name but a few. All of them a crude mix of nationalism, social Darwinism, and bastardized paganism, the archetypal idolatrous societies, with a ruthless self-belief alongside an equally ruthless brutality, resulting in authorized mass murder and genocide. At home, I've got an old 1930s poster from Germany, a Nazi poster. It proudly proclaims that you can't be a good German and a Christian. How long before we are going to end up in such a place? The evidence of history is that those civilizations that value right instead of might, which care for the vulnerable as for the strong, which defend the sanctity of human life and fight for the rights of the individual, become the ones that flourish. No political system that denied these things has survived for very long. The Third Reich, you may remember, was going to last for 1,000 years. It survived for 12. Communism was going to be the end of history. It lasted 70 years. Yet Jewry and Christianity, which were tiny sects, the Jewish people are very small number of Jews around the world. Christianity started as a tiny sect back in the past. Christianity survived 2,000 years, Jewry for 4,000. Meanwhile, the great empires, which we've seen throughout history, that seemed invincible at the time, the Egyptian, the Syrian, the Babylonian, the Persian, ancient Greek, Roman, all the way through to Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, all of those empires have crashed and burnt. Why? Because if you demoralize society, if you desensitize its ethical values, then it implodes in the end. Where there is no moral component, organizations, societies, civilizations wither and die. And it usually starts with a lack of truth. In a great little book, Os Guinness says that we are increasingly living in a world of lies, hype, and spin. Moving values dictated by circumstances, not by eternal perspectives. Which isn't new, of course. In his cross-examination of Jesus by Pilate, Jesus says that everybody on the side of truth listens to him. What was Pilate's reply? What is truth? And the irony is, it's standing right in front of him, looking him in the face. Pilate refused to acknowledge it. Instead, as we'll see later on this evening, he turns his back on it and tries to wash his hands of the problem. And Paul, in his second letter to Timothy, one of my favourite passages from Scripture in the context of the conversation, urges Timothy to patiently preach the word, in season and out of season, in order to correct, rebuke, and encourage. Why? Because he says the time will come when men will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a number of preachers, a great number of teachers, to say what their itching ears want to hear. They will turn their ears away from the truth and turn aside to myths. For many today, truth is created by me, individually. And to be correct, we must therefore talk about truths, plural, not truth. The first rule of politics is to define and create the reality that you want. Lying is no longer lying if you're telling your own personal truth. My other favourite quote was Mort Sahl, who was the Chief of Staff in the White House. And Mort Sahl famously declared that George Washington couldn't tell a lie. Richard Nixon couldn't tell the truth. Bill Clinton didn't know the difference. And neither can Boris or Donald Trump or a whole raft of other modern day politicians. Truths for these guys are driven by their emotions and are easily changeable over time. And reluctant to be seen as judgmental, I think one of our problems for us, and I know not everybody here is a Christian, but this is about me laying out these issues for us to have conversation with and discuss. But for many Christians today, we seem to believe that our faith is probably true because it feels good for me, but it might not suit everybody else. But a vague belief in something doesn't make it true. Only truth makes something true. Without truth, a belief is only speculation plus sincerity. The Christian faith, with all of our limitations in understanding it, is not true because it works for me. It works for me because it's true. It's not true because I experience it. I experience it, however thinly or meanly or in doubt or changing whatever, deeply or gloriously. I experience it because it is true. It's not simply true for me and a couple of us. It's true for everybody who wants to seek it. Young, old, poor, rich, powerless, powerful, all races, all classes, all generations. Anchored in reality, not short-term emotions, which quickly die when the heat is on, God's truth doesn't yield to fashion or opinion or office or rank or title, the views of the powerful, or even the sincerity of great minds. It's true everywhere, for everyone, under all conditions. A lie has no power over us except that we believe it. God's truth is true even if nobody believes it, just as it is fact that the world's falsehoods and lies are falsehoods and lies even if everybody believes them. God's truth is true even if nobody believes it, just as lies are lies even if everybody believes them. And in a world of lies and spin and hype, I believe that we need truth more than ever before. If you stand by my teaching, Jesus said, as the word, the logos, as the very meaning of meaning, then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. With the belt of his truth buckled around our waist, we can stand firm and make a difference in this world. As Solzhenitsyn once said, one word of truth outweighs the entire world. Speaking about his battle with communism in his book The Oak and the Calf, he wrote this: "It is infinitely difficult to begin when mere words must remove a great block of inert matter, i.e. communism. But there is no other way if none of the material strength, if none of the political power, if none of the economic power is on your side. You just have to shout out truth. And a shout in the mountains, he said, has been known to start avalanches. Like him, we need to stand firm, take the fight to the enemy, and shout out truth. And in doing so, start some avalanches and turn back the tide. And we need to do it because we're losing the fight. Western civilization was once embedded in the roots, the soil of Judeo-Christianity. And our accepted standards of morality, that moral component, was rooted in that Judeo-Christian code. Integrity, honor, courage, the other moral goods grew out of the fertile earth. But we live today in what I think hopefully has been called a cut flower society. We have quite a big garden, we have some lovely flowers in it. My wife obviously cuts them occasionally and puts them in a jug on the dining room table. And they look great for about 2 weeks. We all know what happens to cut flowers. They wither and they die, and in 2 weeks' time they end up in the brown bin. They may look fine for a while, but separated from the earth in which they were raised and put in a vase, they quickly fade away. They don't spread fresh seeds, they don't regenerate the moral goods, they don't create new life. They simply wither and die. And the moral goods, which I've talked about, when they're separated from the biblical earth, rot in the end. And they don't get passed on from generation to generation. I was chatting last night with a couple of you about this. I live by my values, but I don't believe in the Judeo-Christian ethic. Fine. Flowers look fine for a while. But how are you going to pass those moral goods? How are you going to pass those values to your children and your grandchildren? What will that look like? Yet millions are prepared to drift along with the secular ideas in our brave new celebrity-driven world. And the consequences are severe. In a society dominated by the iPad, the iPod, the iPlayer, and the selfie, there were close to 250,000 abortions in England and Wales last year. 680 every day. At the other end of the spectrum, the ever-expanding reach of assisted suicide laws gets bigger and bigger. In a recent poll in Canada, 28% believe that if you are homeless, you should be offered the choice of assisted suicide. And if you're poor, you should be offered the choice. Unbelievably, the figure jumps to 41% believe that between the ages of 18 and 34. This is a generation that's growing up without being rooted in the values of the moral component that I'm talking about. The Netherlands and Belgium aren't far behind. How long before we join them? Is the assisted suicide bill an inevitability going through Parliament? I think there's a malignant cancer in our society. It's not a cancer of immorality. There has always been immorality. It's a cancer of amorality, a belief that anything goes, where there's no right or wrong, where everything is equally valid and valuable. It's not new, but I think it's getting worse. General Omar Bradley, who was the US commander in France in 1944-45, said this about over 50 years ago now. Humanity, he said, is in danger of being trapped in this world by its moral adolescence. Our knowledge of science has clearly outstripped our capacity to control it. Mankind is stumbling through a spiritual darkness whilst toying with the secrets of life and death. We have too many men of science, he said, and too few men of God. We have grasped the mystery of the atom and rejected the Sermon on the Mount. The world has achieved brilliance without wisdom, power without conscience. Ours is a world of nuclear giants and ethical infants. Great quote. Cancers are, of course, very difficult to detect early. But if the brutal symptoms are recognized and faced up to, they can be relatively easy to cure. I had my prostate taken out 18 months ago because they identified it very early. But if they're not detected early, if they're detected late, they are, of course, difficult, sometimes impossible to cure. So we need to face up to this reality of the cancer in our society, and I think we need to do it quickly. And there's no clever technique that is going to solve it. No act of Parliament or amount of money will make it right. So we have to engage. The option of retreating, pulling up the drawbridge, and leaving others to live in denial is not the answer. Silence is the enemy of truth. We need to fill the space. We need to fill the silence, the void. We need to fill it with meaning, and we need to challenge the lives of those around us. Like those living near a river in a rising flood, we too will be eventually overwhelmed if we try to simply occupy a high moral ground. That is going to achieve nothing. Bishop James finished his thought for today by quoting further from MacGuff. The last scene of all, says MacGuff, that ends this strange eventual history is mere oblivion. But if oblivion, says Bishop James, is our soul's end, then there is no destiny by which to set a compass for our journey, no ultimate standard by which to govern our lives, no higher authority to which we are all accountable. If that is right, then the world is simply a stage, giant TV screen, just a soap opera. And the stars and the celebrities have become our gods. And James concludes, the world is not a soap opera, and we are much more than simply bit players that drift into and out of the action. We do have a compass. We have an ultimate standard, a higher authority to whom we are accountable. We serve a God who is sovereign, ultimate disposer of individuals and nations, and we belong to a kingdom that is universal, eternal, and unbounded. And he's right. And knowing that and holding on to that, we can stand firm, hold firm, and stand and make a difference. Which isn't easy. Of course it isn't easy. And we will fail, which is what I'm going to be talking about this evening. And it takes courage to speak out into this world. It's intimidating, which is what I want to talk about tomorrow morning. In the meantime, let me ask you this. What does the moral component look like in your life, in your business? What is the foundation on which that moral component is built? Is it enduring? How do you see the issue of truth and where we are in a society? And what are you going to do about it? That's me.